My Ferrari is yours if you can beat me. In that old clunker of yours, laughed millionaire Richard Coleman, his voice echoing across the corporate parking lot, loud enough for all the employees to hear. The 58-year-old black man standing next to the faded blue 1965 Cadillac didn't even look up. James Washington had cleaned those offices for 15 years, always arriving before everyone else and leaving after the lights went out. His callous fingers held the keys to the car he had inherited from his father, a mechanic who had taught him that dignity was not measured by the shine of the paint or the roar of the engine. "Did you hear what I said, old man?" insisted Coleman, adjusting the gold watch on his wrist as the phones rose around them like small spotlights. The CEO of Coleman Industries loved an audience, especially when he could demonstrate his superiority over the little guys. James finally looked up, his calm eyes meeting Coleman's with a serenity that made some of the observers involuntarily fall silent. "I heard you, Mr. Coleman. You want to bet your company in a race against my Cadillac." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Coleman laughed even louder, clapping his hands slowly. "Exactly. That dinosaur. Against my $2 million Ferrari. La Ferrari. If by some miracle you manage to beat me, the company is yours. When I win." He paused dramatically. "You clean my car every weekend for the rest of the year. No extra pay." The employees exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some whispered about the obvious cruelty of the proposal. Others discreetly recorded it, predicting that it would go viral. For all the wrong reasons. The gleaming red Ferrari seemed to mock the Cadillac next to it like a predator toying with its prey. James walked slowly to his car, ran his hand over the scratched bodywork, and muttered something no one could hear. Then he turned to Coleman with a half smile that few could interpret. "All right, Mr. Coleman. I accept your bet." The crowd erupted in whispers. Coleman clapped his hands, ecstatic at what he considered a guaranteed victory. But some more attentive employees noticed something peculiar in James's demeanor. The same unshakable calm he maintained when he knew exactly where to find any lost document or when he solved problems that left managers perplexed. While Coleman showed off his Ferrari for the cameras, James discreetly opened the hood of his Cadillac. What he did there too quickly for the cameras to capture would make all the difference in the next 15 minutes. What no one in that parking lot knew was that James Washington kept secrets about that car that would turn what seemed like public humiliation into the greatest lesson in humility Richard Coleman had ever received. If you're curious to find out how a 58-year-old janitor was about to rewrite the rules of the game, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next was far beyond anything either of them could have imagined. News of the bet spread through Coleman Industries like wildfire. Within 15 minutes, the parking lot was packed with employees holding up their phones, some live streaming to thousands of people. Coleman loved every second of the attention, posing next to his Ferrari as if he were about to star in his own commercial. "Guys, check this out," Coleman shouted to the cameras, patting the shiny hood. $2 million of pure Italian engineering versus a piece of junk my grandfather drove in his youth. The crowd laughed nervously, but some employees exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had known James for years. The man who always arrived 2 hours before work, who knew every corner of that building better than the owner himself, who had trained half of the new employees with a patience that bordered on the supernatural. Jennifer Walsh, human resources manager, whispered to a colleague, "This is wrong. James's children to support," but her voice was drowned out by the deafening roar of the Ferrari as Coleman floored the accelerator, making a point of showing off what he called real power. James stood motionless next to his Cadillac, watching the spectacle with the same calm that had accompanied him since he started working there. What no one knew, and what he had never told anyone, was that this car carried the history of 3 generations of Washingtons. His grandfather, William, had bought the 1965 Cadillac New, working double shifts at a steel mill to pay for each installment. It had been the family's first car, a symbol of dignity that no adversity had been able to break. When William died, he left the car to Thomas, James's father, who kept it running. Through decades of financial hardship, Thomas had taught his son that the Cadillac was not just a means of transportation. It was a lesson in persistence, in maintaining dignity, even when the whole world tried to convince him he didn't deserve it. My father always said that a real man is not measured by what he has, but by what he does with what he has, James muttered to himself, running his hand over the scratched bodywork. What he had done under the hood a few minutes earlier was not just mechanical maintenance. It was the application of 50 years of automotive knowledge that he had inherited, refined, and perfected. Coleman approached, now speaking directly to an iPhone camera. You are about to see a perfect demonstration of how the world really works. Money, power, technology, that's what wins. Not cheap sentimentality about old cars and impossible dreams. He laughed with calculated cruelty. James here is about to learn a valuable lesson about knowing his place in the food chain. The crowd grew even larger. Secretaries came down from the upper floors. Security guards abandoned their posts. Even some customers approached the windows to watch the spectacle. What had started as a dispute between 2 men was turning into an event that would define the culture of that company forever. Michael Torres, a young intern who always greeted James with genuine respect, approached discreetly. Mr. Washington, you don't have to do this. Everyone knows this is unfair. James smiled for the first time that day, an expression that carried decades of wisdom, accumulated in silence. Sometimes, Michael, life gives us opportunities to show who we really are. Not when we're on top, but when we're being underestimated. His words were interrupted by the sound of tires screeching on the asphalt as Coleman made yet another unnecessary demonstration of his Ferrari's power. What James didn't tell the young intern, and what he would only discover in the next few minutes, was that this 1965 Cadillac concealed modifications that transformed what looked like a relic into something that Ferrari engineers would have difficulty understanding. Modifications that he and his father had patiently implemented over decades, tested on rural tracks on weekends, perfected with the care of someone who knew that one day he would need to prove that dignity and intelligence are worth more than money and arrogance. Coleman turned to James with a smile dripping with contempt. Last chance to back down. Old man, I can still be generous and let you keep your job if you admit you've gone too far. The proposal was met with laughter from the sycophants who always surrounded the CEO, but also with an uncomfortable silence from those who knew James Washington's unshakable character. For a moment, when James lowered his head slightly in the face of the growing insults, everyone thought they had broken his spirit. But anyone who was really watching would have noticed that his shoulders were not bent in defeat, but rather in the intense concentration of someone who was about to rewrite the rules of a game they thought they knew completely. While Coleman posed for more photos with his Ferrari, James walked quietly to the workshop at the back of the company parking lot. Few employees knew that this space, officially used for equipment maintenance, had become his personal sanctuary for the past 5 years. There, in the quiet early mornings before work, he worked on a project that none of his colleagues could imagine. James, are you sure about this? Asked David Chun, a retired Ford mechanical engineer who had become a close friend of James after casually discovering his deep knowledge of engines. David watched nervously as James adjusted components in the Cadillac engine with the precision of a surgeon. Coleman isn't just arrogant, he's cruel. If this goes wrong, James didn't stop working. His hands moved with a confidence that Impressed David every time they met. My father used to say that the difference between an ordinary mechanic and a true craftsman is not in the tools but in understanding that every engine has a soul. He tightened an almost invisible electrical connection. This one has the soul of 3 generations of Washingtons who refused to bow their heads. What David had discovered about James over the past few months had left him perplexed. This man who cleaned offices during the day possessed a knowledge of automotive engineering that rivaled the best experts David had met in 40 years. At Ford, James didn't just understand engines. He redesigned them, transformed them, made them transcend their original limitations. You never told me how you learned all this, David murmured, watching James connect a custom electronic fuel injection system he had built himself. This is technology I've only seen in development labs. James paused his work, wiping his hands on the rag he always carried in his pocket. When my father bought this used Cadillac for my grandfather in 1987, it was broken. The engine was blown. The transmission was ruined. The electrical system was fried. I was 12 years old, and he said to me, "Son, we're going to learn how to bring this beauty back to life because a man who knows how to breathe life into what others discard will never be broken by anyone." James's voice carried a reverence that made David stop reviewing the electronic components. We spent the next 6 years rebuilding this car, not just fixing it, reinventing it. My father worked in construction during the day, studied engineering at night at the public library, and on weekends taught me everything he had learned. When he died, in 1995, this Cadillac had an engine that no automaker had ever been able to create. David shook his head in disbelief. James, what you're telling me is that you and your father turned a 1965 Cadillac into something that Coleman and his $2 million can't buy. James added, closing the hood gently. Intelligence, patience, and 3 decades of passion for perfection. You can't buy that at a dealership. From outside the workshop came the sounds of the growing crowd. Coleman had begun narrating a detailed list of his Ferrari specifications to the cameras like a sports commentator describing an invincible champion. His voice echoed through the parking lot with an arrogance that grew with each sentence. "Folks, you're looking at 963 horsepower. Here," Coleman shouted, pounding on the hood of the Ferrari. "All-wheel drive, active suspension, Formula One, aerodynamics. This is what real excellence means, not cheap sentimentality about old cars." The crowd laughed. Some applauded. Others just recorded in silence. Jennifer Walsh, the human resources manager, managed to approach James when he returned to the main parking lot. "James, you don't have to do this. Everyone knows Coleman is being unfair. I can talk to the board of directors. Explain that this has gone too far." James smiled at Jennifer with the same kindness he had shown her 15 years ago. "Thank you, Jennifer. But sometimes the most important lessons can't be taught in boardrooms. They need to be lived in front of witnesses." Michael Torres, the young intern, approached carrying a professional camera. "Mr. Washington, can I film the race? I have a good camera here. If something unfair happens, at least we'll have a quality record." His eyes sparkled with a youthful indignation that touched James deeply. "Yes, you can film it, Michael, but promise me one thing. No matter what happens, you document everything honestly. The truth is always more powerful than propaganda." James put his hand on the young man's shoulder. "And when you grow up, remember that a man's character is not measured by what he has, but by how he treats those who cannot repay him." Coleman interrupted the moment by approaching the group with his usual toxic energy. "Are the touching conversations over? Because I have a tight schedule today. After humiliating the janitor here, I still need to close a $50 million deal." He laughed at his own joke as his sycophants accompanied him like a rehearsed choir. "By the way, James, Coleman continued, raising his voice to make sure everyone heard. When you lose, and you will lose spectacularly, I want you to thank me for the free lesson on social hierarchy. Some people are born to lead, others to serve. Today, you will find out definitively which category you fall into. The calculated cruelty of the words made several employees look away embarrassed. Others, however, began filming more intensely, realizing they were documenting something that would go viral. The question was whether it would be for James' humiliation or Coleman's excessive arrogance. James remained motionless, watching Coleman with his usual calm. But David Chun, watching discreetly from the back, noticed something the others missed. The slight smile that played at the corners of James's mouth when Coleman finished his speech. It wasn't nervousness or discomfort. It was the expression of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. Just one more question, Coleman, James said calmly. When you bought that Ferrari, did you research anything about the engine's history, or did you just trust what the salesman said? Coleman frowned, irritated by the unexpected question. Of course, I did. I bought it from the official dealer with all the documentation. Why do you ask? Curiosity, James replied, walking toward his Cadillac. Sometimes the most expensive machines have the best kept secrets. The phrase echoed across the parking lot with an ambiguity that caused some of those present to exchange puzzled glances. Coleman laughed, dismissively, but a keen observer would have noticed a slight irritation in his eyes, the kind of discomfort that arises when someone we consider inferior demonstrates knowledge of our weaknesses. As the crowd gathered to watch the race, James made his final adjustment to the Cadillac's dashboard. A small, almost imperceptible switch that activated modifications that 30 years of passion and engineering had made possible. What was about to happen would not just be a race between two cars, but a definitive demonstration that true excellence cannot be bought. It must be built one piece at a time, with one's own hands and a lot of sweat. The starting line was improvised with 2 secretaries holding white handkerchiefs while more than 200 people crowded around with phones raised. What had started as a private humiliation was now being broadcast live to thousands of viewers on social media with hashtags like #Ferrari vs Cadillac and #Justice Race gaining viral traction in real time. Coleman positioned his Ferrari on the line, revving the engine repeatedly to intimidate James with a deafening roar of $2 million of Italian technology. Last chance to back out, old man, he shouted through the window while some of his sycophants laughed and cheered as if they were at a private show. James simply adjusted the Cadillac's rearview mirror and muttered to David Chun, who was standing next to the track, "My father used to say that pride comes before a fall." Coleman never properly researched what he bought. 5 4 3 2 1 go, shouted Jennifer Walsh, dropping the white handkerchief. The Ferrari shot out like a rocket, tires screeching on the asphalt, creating a cloud of white smoke as Coleman accelerated with all the power available. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as the red car sped down the 800-meter straight they had marked out in the company's expanded parking lot. James' Cadillac started smoothly, almost silently, like a predator that doesn't need to roar to be deadly. Coleman was already 200 meters ahead when something unexpected happened. A sharp, metallic noise cut through the air. It wasn't coming from the Cadillac, but from the Ferrari. Coleman felt a strange vibration in the steering wheel, followed by a sudden loss of power. He glanced at the dashboard, and his arrogant smile vanished instantly. The engine temperature was skyrocketing. Warning lights were flashing like a Christmas tree, and the engine began to make a noise that any mechanic would recognize as a symptom of imminent destruction. "What the hell?" Coleman muttered, pressing even harder on the accelerator in desperation. The Ferrari responded with an unhealthy roar, then began to lose speed rapidly. Meanwhile, James discreetly activated the special Switch on the Cadillac's dashboard. What happened next defied all the laws of physics that observers thought they knew. The engine of the 1965 Cadillac was transformed. The soft purr gave way to a deep, powerful roar that made the ground vibrate beneath the spectators' feet. James had activated the system that he and his father had spent decades perfecting, a custom hybrid engine that combined the classic soul of the original V8 with electronic turbocharger technology that he himself had developed, using engineering knowledge that few experts in the world possessed. "My God," whispered Michael Torres, filming as the Cadillac accelerated with a force that seemed impossible for a car of that era. "What's going on?" David Chin smiled, knowing exactly what James had done. Those modifications weren't just mechanical, they were a work of engineering art that had transformed the Cadillac into something unique in the world. 3 decades of sleepless nights, weekends in the workshop, and self-taught studies of aerodynamics and electronic systems had created a monster. Disguised as a relic, the Cadillac caught up with the broken Ferrari in seconds, passed it as if Coleman were standing still, and continued accelerating to the finish line with an elegance that left the crowd in absolute silence. Coleman managed to get his Ferrari to the finish line, but the engine died completely just 50 meters from the end, forcing him to push the $2 million car under the astonished gaze of hundreds of cameras, recording his humiliation in high definition. When he finally crossed the line, sweating and panting, he found James standing calmly beside his Cadillac, wiping his hands on the same cloth he always carried, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "How?" Coleman managed to murmur, his face red with exhaustion and disbelief. "Research, Coleman," James replied calmly. "You should have done your research before buying your Ferrari." Michael Torres approached with the camera, capturing every expression on Coleman's face. "Mr. Coleman, would you like to explain to our online viewers how you lost to a 1965 Cadillac?" "That's impossible," Coleman exploded, kicking the tire of his dead Ferrari. "This is rigged. No one builds a Cadillac that outperforms a Ferrari." David Chun approached carrying a briefcase full of documents. "Actually, Coleman, there's something more important you need to know about research." He opened the briefcase and took out a stack of official papers. "James asked me to investigate the history of your Ferrari's engine while you were preparing for the race. We found something interesting." Coleman frowned, still trying to process his humiliating defeat. "What investigation?" "Your LaFerrari has a known manufacturing defect," David continued, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "Engine number 477891. Produced in October 2020. There has been an active recall from the manufacturer for 8 months to correct critical overheating in extreme stress situations." The crowd murmured, phones reaching out to capture the documents. "You never took your car to the dealership for the fix," David continued relentlessly. "And even more interesting, this is the third Ferrari with serious defects that you've bought in the last 2 years. James did a thorough investigation into your buying habits." Coleman turned pale. "How do you know that?" James spoke for the first time since crossing the finish line. 15 years of cleaning offices has taught me many things, Coleman. For example, that arrogant people like you always leave important documents lying on their desks. I always knew you bought expensive cars just to impress, without researching quality or reliability. For years, James continued in a calm but penetrating voice, I listened to your phone conversations while cleaning your office. I knew you spent fortunes on cars that constantly break down while paying miserable wages to the employees who keep this company running. Jennifer Walsh approached with another set of documents. Coleman, there's one more thing you should know. The board of directors watched this entire race via live broadcast. They called me 5 minutes ago. Coleman tried to sound confident, but his voice trembled. So what? I'm still the CEO of this company. Actually, Jennifer continued, you're not anymore. The board voted unanimously for your immediate removal from office for inappropriate conduct and damage to the corporate image. The recordings of this humiliation are already circulating with millions of views. Furthermore, she added, pulling another piece of paper from her briefcase. According to the terms of the bet you yourself proposed publicly in front of witnesses and cameras, James is now the legal owner of 51% of the shares of your personal company, Coleman Industries. The silence that followed was deafening. Coleman looked around, seeing hundreds of people recording his complete disintegration, his investors exchanging disapproving glances, employees whispering among themselves about the dramatic downfall of the man who had intimidated them for years. This is ridiculous, Coleman shouted, but his voice sounded desperate. A janitor can't run a company. James stepped forward, his presence suddenly seeming larger and more imposing than it had ever been. Coleman, you underestimated me for 15 years. You thought that because I cleaned offices, I was ignorant. But while you were wasting money on expensive, defective toys, I was studying mechanical engineering, business administration, economics. I know more about running a company than you ever did. And one more thing, James added, looking Coleman straight in the eye. I won't take your company. I don't want anything that was built with cruelty and arrogance. Coleman blinked in confusion. Then what do you want? Justice, James replied, simply. I want you to learn that respect cannot be bought with money and that dignity is priceless. And I want everyone to see that true victory is not destroying those who humiliated you, but proving that you are always better than they imagined. Michael Torres, still filming, asked the question everyone wanted to hear. Mr. Washington, how do you feel now? James smiled for the first time that day, a smile that carried 58 years of dignity preserved against all odds. I feel like my father would be proud, not for the race, but for maintaining my integrity until the end. As Coleman stood there humiliated in front of hundreds of cameras, surrounded by the wreckage of his arrogance and self-proclaimed superiority, a single question echoed in the comments of the live broadcasts. If a man can build something so extraordinary in silence, keeping his talents to himself while facing daily humiliation, what other surprises exist in the people we underestimate every day? James Washington adjusted his tie for the third time that morning, still unaccustomed to the 15th floor office he now occupied as chief operating officer of Coleman Industries, renamed Washington and Associates. The board of directors had insisted on the promotion after watching him transform the company's toxic culture in just a few weeks. Mr. Washington, Michael Torres, knocked on the door, now serving as his executive assistant after dropping out of college to work with a man who had become his mentor. Business Weekly magazine is here for the interview about transformational leadership. Jennifer Walsh entered shortly after carrying reports that showed a 40% increase in productivity since James had taken the helm. The employees are asking to expand the mentoring program you created. They want to implement it in all branches. Through the window, James could see the parking lot where it all began. His 1965 Cadillac, now proudly restored, occupied the spot reserved for the board of directors alongside the most modern executive cars, a daily reminder that excellence has no age or price. Coleman watched from the window of the one-bedroom apartment he now shared with two roommates, his savings depleted after the lawsuits and viral humiliation that had cost him his investments. The video of the race had racked up 50 million views with titles like Arrogant CEO Destroyed by Genius Janitor and The Most Satisfying Humiliation on the Internet. No company wanted to hire him. His name had become synonymous with toxic corporate arrogance. The Ferrari, auctioned off to pay legal debts. James never sought out Coleman to brag or humiliate him. His revenge had been much more elegant to prove that dignity, intelligence, and hard work are worth more than inherited money and empty arrogance. The modified Cadillac he had built with his father was not just a car, it was the embodiment of a philosophy that Coleman never understood, that true excellence is built quietly, one piece at a time, with your own hands. David Chun, now a technical consultant for the company, used to tell new employees, James taught us that underestimating people based on appearances is the most costly mistake anyone can make. True revenge was never about winning a race or humiliating an arrogant CEO. It was about proving that while some waste fortunes buying status symbols, others invest time and energy in building something genuinely extraordinary. Coleman tried to destroy James with prejudice and arrogance, but ended up revealing to the whole world that dignity, intelligence, and persistence are much more powerful forces than money and contempt. If this story has inspired you to never underestimate anyone based on appearances, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that character always wins over arrogance.